Welcome. I'm Professor Bob Dise. We'll be together for 36 lectures, so I should tell you a little something about myself. I got my bachelor's degree from the University of Virginia in history, spent 4 years in the Air Force as a fighter controller in NORAD, and went back to the University of Michigan where I got my master's and doctorate in ancient history, concentrating on the history of Rome. I wrote my dissertation on the origins of imperial provincial administration and the Roman army. I taught for 5 years at Clinch Valley College of the University of Virginia, and since 1992, I've been on the faculty of the Department of History at the University of Northern Iowa, where I offer courses in humanities, the history of ancient Greece, ancient Rome, classical civilization, and the history of the ancient Near East. Today, when we think of the conquerors of the ancient world and their empires, we tend to think in terms of Alexander and Caesar, of Greece and Rome. But in the lectures you're about to hear, I'll be exploring the world that came before. Because when Alexander the Great seized the attention of the world, forging an empire that stretched from Greece to India, a dozen other empires had already come and gone in the lands he conquered. They don't capture our attention the way that Alexander's does. Why should we study them? Well, first we should study them because of the sheer magnitude of their history. The stage on which the lives of these empires were played out spanned half the world, from the Indus River Valley in the east to the Straits of Gibraltar in the west. And their story extends across 2,000 years, 40% of all recorded human history, from the first dawn of civilization down to the present. And we should also study them because they were the world's first empires. They were the architects of empire. They were the ones who laid out the paths that knowingly or unknowingly every future empire would follow. When Caesar marched into Gaul, when Alexander crossed over into Asia, it was in their footsteps that they followed. Until 200 years ago, most of these empires were little more than names. Some had been entirely forgotten. It was only with the birth of archaeology during the 19th century that we acquired the tools that we needed to reveal their rich history. Now we've uncovered their cities. We've recovered their libraries. We've deciphered their languages. Now, at last, we can hear their voices, and now, at last, they can tell us their stories. But we should begin our exploration by defining our terms, by answering a few fundamental questions. The first and most basic is, what is an empire? Our English word empire comes from the Latin word imperium, a word that lay at the heart of early Roman government. Originally, imperium meant command or sovereignty, and referred to the power wielded by the kings who ruled over Rome in her early days when she was nothing but a small city-state on the western side of Italy. After the last of the kings was overthrown and Rome became a commonwealth, a res publica or republic, imperium came to mean the power bestowed on Rome's senior magistrates, the consuls and the praetors. It was the power to command and to judge. It was the power to lead armies. And it was the power to order executions of citizens as well as of non-Romans. But after Rome began to conquer the empire for which she's famous, the meaning of imperium shifted again. It came to mean dominion or realm. And so the dominion of the Romans was called the Imperium Romanum, the Roman Empire. And so imperium became empire. What is it that distinguishes an empire from any other political entity? When we look back at some of the best-known empires of the past, it becomes clear that empire does not refer to a form of government. After all, Rome was a republic when she conquered most of her empire in the Mediterranean and Western Europe, and Athens was a democracy, one of the most direct democracies the world has ever known, when she ruled her empire in the Aegean. The England that forged the famous empire in which the sun never set during the 18th and 19th centuries was a parliamentary monarchy. The Holy Roman Empire of medieval Germany was a crazy quilt feudal mishmash of more than 300 nearly independent duchies, counties, and archbishoprics with only a figurehead emperor. Which means that virtually any sort of government known to humankind can preside over an empire, including, as in the case of the Holy Roman Empire, virtually no government at all. So if any sort of government can rule an empire, then maybe empire refers instead to the swath of territory over which that government rules. So is it size that makes an empire? It's tempting to think so, but in this as in other things, maybe we should resist temptation. Because while some empires were very large, like Alexandria's empire, the Roman Empire, the British Empire, the Mongol Empire, the Arab Empire of the early Middle Ages, other empires are much more modest. The medieval Holy Roman Empire was small compared to the original unholy Roman Empire. And the Byzantine Empire, which was the eastern half of the original unholy Roman Empire, kept shrinking and shrinking and shrinking until it was little more than the city of Constantinople, when it finally disappeared in 1453, yet it was always called an empire. The Athenian Empire was little more than several dozen islands and a string of coastal enclaves scattered around the Aegean Sea. Okay, so if empires can be big or small, perhaps what defines an empire is the act of one ethnic group imposing its rule over other ethnic groups. It's true that in most empires this is what happened. In the British Empire, the English, Scots, and Welsh imposed their rule on the Indians, Boers, Egyptians, Africans, not to mention the Irish. The Romans imposed their rule on the Gauls, the Greeks, Syrians, the Britons, the Africans, in fact, virtually everyone who lived around the Mediterranean and in Western Europe. But on the other hand, there are empires that keep it all within the family, so to speak. The Athenians only imposed their empire on other Greeks. And then there's the German Empire created by Otto von Bismarck in the late 19th century. Its population was nearly all German. And then there are cases where an ethnic group imposes its rule on other ethnic groups and nobody thinks of it as an act of empire, like when the English took over Scotland and Wales, and when the largely European population of America imposed its rule on all those Native Americans. So in the end, I think what we see is that empire is a subjective term. Empire, in other words, is in the eye of the beholder. Sometimes ambitious or vainglorious states claim the name empire. Bismarck's Germany, for example, and the Holy Roman Empire. Other times historians bestow the name. We're the ones who named Athens Roman Empire. We did the same with the Mongols. And we bestowed the name on the realms covered by this course, which rose and fell long before the Romans gave us the word imperium and our first lesson in how to use it. Even though empire is a subjective term, though, it's still important for historians to study the phenomenon of empire. When we do so, we ask fundamental questions. How empires came to be, how they were governed and defended, and why did they fall? The first question has to do with the origins of empires. In asking how an empire came to be, the great historian Thucydides taught us that historical events have two types of causes, underlying and immediate. Underlying causes are those forces that set the stage for something that happens. They're like wood gathered for a bonfire. Underlying causes can be political, economic, social, or cultural in nature. They can even be natural, climatic, or geological. Immediate causes are those specific things that trigger an event. They're like the match that turns the wood into an inferno. They can be the actions of individuals or groups, but like underlying causes, they can also be economic, political, or natural. The origins of empires turn out to be as diverse as the empires themselves. Some empires result from the energy, leadership, and genius of a single individual, usually a great conqueror, who blazes a swift and memorable trail across the pages of history. Typically, these individuals find themselves in advantageous circumstances and are able to capitalize on the opportunities they present. Alexandria's empire is the best example. He began with some important advantages. His father Philip had created the finest army the ancient world had known and used it to subjugate Greece, which saved Alexander a lot of time and trouble. But it was Alexander who then led that army as far as India and made himself master of the ancient world. As important as his father's contribution was, it was Alexander's own military genius that was the decisive factor in his stunning achievement. Another good example would be the Empire of Napoleon. France was a prosperous country, and the French Revolution had galvanized its population with a vision of liberty, equality, and brotherhood. But it was Napoleon's charismatic leadership and genius that forged the revolutionary levies into a powerful army, swept across Europe, and for 15 years humbled the might of Europe's ancient monarchies. But other empires are the product of many leaders' efforts over a long period of time. These empires grow out of the gradual development of the human, economic, and cultural resources of a people or a region. Rome wasn't built in a day, and neither was its empire. The Roman Empire arose out of the experience of the Romans in conquering and assimilating Italy, the hard lessons they had learned in the Punic Wars, and their aristocratic culture which pitted its members against one another in a competition for glory and honor and the high political office that went with them. The process of conquering Rome's empire spanned more than 3 centuries, and from the organization of Rome's first provinces in around 230 BC to the conquest of Dacia in AD 106, and the list of its conquerors is long and distinguished: Scipio Africanus, Marius, Pompey, Caesar, Tiberius, Trajan. The British Empire is another example. England began building her empire in the early 17th century AD with the establishment of the first of her 13 colonies in North America. She greatly expanded that empire in a series of colonial wars during the 1700s, adding Canada and India, even though she also lost the 13 colonies. Then in the 1800s and early 1900s, the British Empire reached its zenith, sprawling across half of Africa, India, Pakistan, Burma, South Africa, Australia and New Zealand, and a score of island archipelagos in the Pacific and Indian Oceans. And a long roster of conquerors contributed to building that empire: Robert Clive, Horatio Nelson, the Duke of Wellington, Lord Kitchener. Still, whether they were the work of a single individual or the prolonged labor of an entire people, almost all empires were acquired through military conquest. This is why we so often think of conquerors when we think of empires. But this should come as no surprise, because history shows that when countries expand, the process usually involves conflict. When we study these conflicts, we'll learn more if we bear in mind that just as it takes 2 to tango, so it also takes 2 to go to war. So we have to see what we can learn not only about the expanding imperial power, but also about its opponents. Because it isn't just the strengths of the conqueror, it's also the weaknesses of the defeated that account for the conquest. Sometimes those weaknesses are military. Sometimes they're political. And sometimes they're just plain bad luck. Finally, we have to ask ourselves the question that in many ways is the most difficult to answer. What motivates a conqueror or a whole series of conquerors, an entire people, to acquire an empire? History teaches us that sometimes the reasons are economic. England acquired her empire in pursuit of her trading interests, looking for resources and markets. The Dutch and Portuguese did the same with their empires. Sometimes the reasons involve what we today would call homeland security. This concern about potential foreign threat seems to have been one of the motivations behind Rome's expansion, following her second war with Carthage. Religious passion can drive people towards conquest too. The explosive expansion of the Arab Empire in the 7th century AD was driven by a zeal for Islam. Similarly, the Spanish conquest of the New World was driven as much by missionary fervor to spread Christianity as it was by a lust for gold and silver. But the most pervasive of all motivations isn't economic or political or religious. I submit it's psychological. It's a yearning for power, for glory, for fame, a burning desire to know what lies beyond the next mountain and to assert your authority out to the limits of an ever-receding horizon. We can call it the dream of empire. It is that dream, once it begins to burn in the hearts and minds of leaders and peoples, that drives them on into the pages of history for good or for ill. Ask Alexander. Ask Caesar. Ask Napoleon. Ask Hitler. Conquering an empire is the easy part, though. Next, it has to be governed and defended. Those are far more demanding and complicated tasks, as we can see from the wide range of approaches that have been used for both. Some imperial powers prefer to rule their subject territories directly and exploit them for the benefit of the conquering people. The Spanish Empire of the 16th through 19th centuries was such an empire. Viceroys were appointed, presiding over governors and a host of lesser administrative officials. The Native American subject peoples of the empire will work tirelessly in the extraction of mineral resources, the production of agricultural goods for consumption and export. Rome tried this approach in the 2nd and 1st centuries BC. But the results of this approach are often counterproductive. Spain saw the population of her overexploited and disease-racked colonial possessions decline by more than 90%. Both Rome and Spain faced repeated rebellions from subjects who felt that under the circumstances they had little to lose. Other imperial powers adopt a more conciliatory approach. Their governors allow the locals a free hand in administrating their own affairs, practicing their own culture and religion. Rome adopted this approach during the 1st and 2nd centuries AD. England used this approach in India. It worked well, and when paired with the assimilation of native elites into the imperial governing system as Rome did, it might even win the hearts and minds of the empire's subjects. Some empires are made up of vassal states which are left under their own leaders, who are bound by oaths of loyalty to their imperial overlord. This is a sort of feudal model. It minimizes the effort and expense of ruling an empire, but there's always the danger of the vassals slowly chipping away at the imperial authority and making themselves independent. The task of defending an empire is at least as daunting as the task of governing one, and the range of approaches that have been tried is just as broad. The obvious solution is to maintain a standing army, poised to leap into action and positioned so as to defend all likely trouble spots. There are drawbacks to this. Rome tried this approach in the 1st through 5th centuries AD. And what she discovered is that standing armies are very expensive, both in terms of salaries and supplies. She also found out that you can never adequately defend every potential trouble spot. So another approach is to establish a small professional force, a regular army, and supplement it with provincial levies or reservists in time of danger. England basically did this with her empire. In the American War of Independence, British regulars were assisted by drafts of American loyalists or Tories. In her wars in southern Africa and India, England mustered troops from her loyal subjects in the area as well as from parts of the empire as far away as Canada and Australia. The problem with this approach, though, is making sure that the reserve forces are well equipped and well trained enough to function alongside the regulars in the field. So finally, an empire can choose to maintain only the most minimal garrison forces and to raise new armies, usually of mercenaries, whenever a threat arises. This has the advantage of minimizing military expenditures in peacetime. And it imposes minimal strain on citizen manpower resources while making sure that the troops you do use are high-quality professionals. But its great drawback is that it requires time to hire and organize an expeditionary force made up of mercenaries. And in war, time is precious. The last question we have to ask ourselves is, how do empires end? In the 18th century, Edward Gibbon indelibly imprinted the notion of decline and fall on our minds with his magisterial work, The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. But every empire passes from the stage of history in its own way, at its own pace, and for its own reasons. In the case of the Roman Empire, it's worth doing the math and looking at the time scale involved in Gibbon's process of decline and fall. He dates the beginning of the decline to the death of Marcus Aurelius in AD 180. He completes the story of the fall with the Turkish conquest of Constantinople in 1453. So, by his reckoning, the process of decline and fall required no fewer than 1,273 years, which is 340 years longer than the history of Rome from the founding of the city up to the death of Marcus Aurelius. and longer, in fact, than the entire lifespan of any other empire in human history. Which means that most empires would be happy simply to survive for 1,273 years, much less spend that much time on the process of declining and falling. But Gibbon was right that there is often a period of decline before an empire's fall. It's as if whatever internal glue it is that holds an empire together slowly weakens. But even then, some trigger, some immediate cause, is necessary to precipitate the final drama. A good example is the Chinese Empire. China failed to modernize and therefore was unable to resist the European powers that carved it up into so-called spheres of influence during the late 19th century. But it took the uprisings in 1911 to topple the last imperial dynasty, and about 40 years of civil war ensued before the communist victory in 1949 finally restored order, though at a great price. Other empires collapsed because the internal glue that held them together was the genius of a great conqueror, and when that conqueror is defeated or removed, it turns out that there is no internal cohesion to his empire. Alexander's empire, for example, barely outlived Alexander. And sometimes empires fall simply because their enemies defeat them. Napoleon's empire fell because his grand army was annihilated during the Russian campaign, and what was left was overwhelmed by a great coalition of European powers. It's with such questions in mind that we will explore the rise, climax, and collapse of those dozen empires that rose and fell in the 2,000 years before Alexander. There's a strong Near Eastern flavor to the course, but the order in which we'll approach those empires is chronological. We'll open by setting the stage with a survey of the geographical arena on which the drama of these empires was played out. That arena stretches from the Pillars of Hercules, the Straits of Gibraltar, to the valley of the Indus River, and from the Fifth Cataract of the Nile to the steppes of Kazakhstan. It includes landscapes that range from the open waters of the Mediterranean to the rugged mountains of the Hindu Kush, from the lush river valleys of Mesopotamia and Egypt to the arid plateaus of Iran. We'll also scrutinize the wildly diverse types of sources on which our knowledge of the ancient Near East is founded. Those include hundreds of thousands of cuneiform tablets from ancient Near Eastern imperial and municipal archives. Sources also include the colorful narratives of Greek, Roman, and Hebrew authors. And in addition, we have the material remains of lost cities and kingdoms, uncovered by more than a century of painstaking archaeological excavation at hundreds of sites. The course begins in Mesopotamia, where history's first empires were born. We start with the first empire in all of human history, the empire of Sargon the Great, of Akkad, who in the late 3rd millennium BC subjugated the city-states of Sumer and went on to conquer a realm that stretched from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean Sea. Sargon became a great hero in Mesopotamian legend and lore, so that 1,500 years later, a ruler of Assyria, at the pinnacle of its power, even took his name, hoping to bask in its glory. The great Akkadian conqueror and his successors pioneered the techniques of imperial rule and set a pattern that later Mesopotamian empires would both emulate and elaborate. And there were many Mesopotamian empires during the centuries after Sargon. Mesopotamia's imperial heyday lasted into the middle of the last millennium BC. The empire that follows Sargon in the sequence is the only empire ever to arise among the cities of Sumeria, 3rd dynasty Ur, often simply called Ur III. Ur III took Sargon's pattern and pushed it to its limit, creating history's first tightly centralized, state-run economy and society. After Ur III, the course looks at one of the most famous Mesopotamian empires, the Empire of Hammurabi. Famed for his code of laws, Hammurabi was also a great conqueror. And he was a hands-on administrator, too, who didn't just rule an empire, he ran it. While Hammurabi's empire is famous, the two empires that followed it in Mesopotamia have nearly been forgotten. Mitanni, the empire of the Hurrians, and the Kassite Empire in Babylonia. Mitanni dominated northern Mesopotamia for 2 centuries. The Kassites ruled Babylonia for no less than 4. Even as Mitanni and the empire of the Kassites were emerging in Mesopotamia, the focus of imperial power began to shift to other regions, presaging Mesopotamia's decline in the ancient world's balance of power. New imperial states emerged and during the late 2nd millennium dominated the stage of Near Eastern history. The earliest of those empires was Hatti, the empire of the Hittites. Hatti lay not in Mesopotamia but in Anatolia, or Asia Minor. Hatti had a different character than the great empires of Mesopotamia. It was very loosely structured, almost feudal in its nature. Soon after the rise of Hatti, Egypt burst free from its homeland in the lower reaches of the Nile Valley, and under the dynamic pharaohs of the new kingdom conquered an empire that stretched from Nubia in the south to Syria in the north. Simultaneously, the world's first sea empire, or thalassocracy, came into being in the Aegean, built by the enigmatic Minoans of the island of Crete. Then the Minoans were succeeded as lords of the Aegean by the first Greeks to stride onto history's stage, the Mycenaeans. In regular diplomatic contact with one another, the Kassites, Mitanni, Hittites, Egyptians, and Mycenaeans formed what scholars have come to call a club of the great powers that dominated the Near East and the Eastern Mediterranean between about 1600 and about 1200 BC. And suddenly, around 1200, the empires that had dominated the Near East for so long all collapsed, swept away by mass movements of peoples and repeated waves of marauding raiders. The migrations of the Aramaeans, the depredations of the so-called Sea Peoples drastically altered the balance of power. And new imperial states emerged during the first half of the first millennium BC. One of those powers was a short-lived Israelite empire of David and Solomon, which arose in the power vacuum left by the collapse of the Egyptian and Hittite empires. The empire over which David and Solomon ruled was the only empire ever created by the peoples of ancient Palestine and Syria, and left a memory that lingers to this day. As David and Solomon's empire was breaking up, the Assyrians were laying the foundations of their empire. By the middle of the 7th century BC, it had become the greatest empire the ancient world had yet known, the entire Near East under its authority. In building their empire, the Assyrians acquired a reputation for ruthless brutality that endures to this day, though it may not be entirely merited. The Assyrian Empire fell before the rising power of the Chaldean, or Neo-Babylonian Empire, the last empire that would ever emerge in Mesopotamia. The Neo-Babylonian rulers were keenly aware of the fact that they were the heirs of Sargon, and consciously patterned themselves on the great Mesopotamian conquerors of the past. With the collapse of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, Mesopotamians sank into political impotence, never to rise to imperial power or even political independence again until modern times. The last two Near Eastern empires explored in this course are the ones that were doomed to fall before the might of Greece and Rome, whose rising power would change the future of Western civilization. Persia, born in the valleys of southwestern Iran, would become the largest empire the world had yet seen, stretching from Libya to India, dwarfing even mighty Assyria. The Persians ruled their huge and fabulously wealthy empire with a tolerance for its bewildering diversity of peoples, cultures, and beliefs. The wealth and power of Persia couldn't stand before the genius and determination of Alexander. And when Persia fell before the onslaught of the Macedonians and Greeks, only one Near Eastern empire was left: Carthage. Few people think of Carthage as a Near Eastern empire because it was located in the Western Mediterranean. But Carthage was a Phoenician settlement, and its empire consisted mostly of the other Phoenician settlements that dotted the coasts of the Western Mediterranean. Like Minoan Crete, Carthage ruled over a thalassocracy that grew out of its far-flung trade networks. But like Persia, Carthage was doomed by the sudden rise of a small state into a great power: Rome. When Rome destroyed Carthage's empire in two bitter wars during the 3rd century BC, and then in a third war destroyed Carthage itself, the story of the imperial Near East came to its end, and this course comes to its conclusion. Final word on the topical focus of the course. Because this is a course about the rise and fall of empires, it concentrates on political and military affairs. Social and cultural issues are not unimportant to the rise and fall of empires, but they often play more subtle and secondary roles. So in this course, narrative will mix with analysis in recounting the clamor of armies, the commands of kings, and the fates of nations. Of such things, the drama of empire has always been made, since the day when Sargon rose up in Akkad. First, we must set the stage, on which the drama was played out.